The Ecuadorian government is fighting a corporation that made billions off Ecuador's resources, but somehow supersedes its laws. Can you talk about how Ecuador ended up in this subordinate position in the first place?
Let's not forget that in a decade prior to our government, we had 7 presidents in 10 years. I mean, this really gives us, illustrates really well the kind of institutional weakness, a kind of failed state. You know, we use the expression failed state in hyper-violent contexts. We think of certain countries which I will not name now, but we think of, you know, civil war, mayhem. Yeah, but failed state can also be a state without institutions, you know, without huge rates of violence. We didn't have massive violence in Ecuador, but nothing worked properly. The state wasn't defending the interests of its citizens. You had these kind of strong men running, you know, often plantation owners, we're going back to the plantation state, running the country, but from a very localized agenda with no real nation-state project. So the recuperation of a nation-state project, the sovereignty, you know, no foreign military bases, the recuperation of oil. Let's not forget that oil used to be in the hands of multinationals, and then they used to pay the state a royalty. Now it's the other way around. The recuperation of sovereignty in terms of debt. There was lots of debt, corrupt debt, acquired by the state through all sorts of illegitimate, illegal, illegitimate, dodgy ways that has been condemned. Probably the most significant change in the last 10 years in Ecuador is the construction of a state, of regulations, of institutions, in a way of modernity. I mean, the kind of state building that has made countries less vulnerable to this kind of predatory behavior on behalf of private actors, but also other states in other cases, you know. So, yeah, this is not something you can change from one day to the next. But I think that the history of Ecuador has been marked by this vulnerability, and the vulnerability is conditioned by the peripheral nature of the Ecuadorian state in the world economy, depending on raw materials, having very small benefits, you know, losing out in the exchange between raw materials and manufactured products. A poor economy, which then makes it much more difficult to build institutions, to build a state, to build sovereignty, and to insert yourself in a sovereign manner in the international system. And if you don't insert yourself in a sovereign manner in the international system, then you're going to be a victim of all sorts of abuses. And of course, the Chevron Texaco abuse is one of the greatest examples, I think, in our region of the kind of abuses you can be a victim of, and the kind of predatory behavior that can suddenly destroy whole communities and indeed the ecosystems of whole regions.
And of course, the development and export of raw materials is a talking point used against Latin America to this day. Venezuela, Ecuador, it's rarely acknowledged what you're saying, that Latin America has, and Ecuador in particular, has incurred centuries of colonialism, also decades of Western capitalism, and how it's ravaged the country.
You have to move away from raw materials, that's clear, and you have to move away from oil, and that's something which a goal that we set for ourselves from the outset. But you don't do this from one day to the next. 9.5 years in our case, you don't turn the page of 500 years or more of depending on raw materials. So you need to do this strategically. You need to use the benefits of oil and reinvest them in all sorts of other sectors. You need to redistribute at the same time as you're growing, and you need to grow redistributing. There's a number of things that you need to do in order to be able to move away from raw materials, particularly investing in education. You can't have a diversified economy with a strong service sector, with a knowledge economy, with all sorts of things that we've set ourselves to do without having human talent. What some people call human capital, we prefer the word human talent. And for that you need to invest in education, you need to invest in higher education. We've just invested in moving away from fossil fuels as well in terms of our energy matrix. So it's a massive investment. I mean, 8 hydroelectric plants in order to be able to produce clean energy and not be burning fuel, you know, and producing CO2. And also by doing that you create kind of other types of industries. You know, the building of the hydroelectric plants itself diversifies the economy, it enables you to industrialize to a certain extent. So it's a long, ongoing process. I mean, I'd like to, by a click of the finger, say, okay, we're done with oil, we do something different, but it's not something that you can do from one day to the next.
It's incredible, this progressive shift. There was an old way of doing things as you're laying out, then this progressive administration comes in, begins this reclamation of the state. But of course, that's sparked huge conflicts, both externally and internally. Can you go over what these conflicts were?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you've had a country that's been ruled by a tiny elite that's not really wanted to redistribute the profits that they've made, I mean, you're affecting interests if you're redistributing, if you're bringing in modernity in what was a pre-modern context, you know, almost feudal. You know, the plantation structure is not exactly very democratic. It has this very small, ownership structure and very, very kind of precarious labor conditions, no social protection, no coverage, terrible labor laws, no minimum wage, etc. So when you start forcing the elites to belong to a social contract, to give rights to workers, to redistribute, to stop fencing themselves away in these kind of hyper-securitized citadels and cities and living next door to horrendous slums, then that creates resistance. I mean, the history of social change, the history of redistribution everywhere in the world is always marked by a degree of conflict. Now the question is to manage that conflict so it doesn't become violent conflict, and I think we've done this through democracy and 10 elections in 10 years and not being afraid of plebiscites and, you know, always abiding by the democratic rules of the game, which gives you lots of legitimacy and also international credibility and enables you to carry on in your reforms. But sure, it's been conflictive. It's been conflict with the big powers who own the whole spectrum of the display of power. Plantations, but also banks, which has a major impact on the financial system. If they want to boycott you, these people can boycott you. And of course, this is something which is rarely said abroad, but it's very important in order to understand media coverage of Ecuador. The big media, the corporate media in Ecuador was owned by these very people. So, you know, when we arrived in government in 2007, there were 5 national TV stations. 4 of them were owned by bankers. Okay, well, there are lots of other parts of the world where we still need to work on that. But Ecuador is certainly one of them. And that's a battle that's hard to give. On the international front, of course, it also has repercussions. I mean, if you're asserting yourself not just in if you're asserting sovereignty not just in a Weberian sense, in a domestic sense, but also in a Westphalian sense, in an international sense, then you're affecting interests. You know, if you're saying, well, we're not just going to be this kind of puppet state, or we're not going to play the kind of you'd be a useful tool in the geopolitical Washington-Bogota alliance in those days, for example, which had a lot to do with Plan Colombia and so on and so forth. And we're going to have our own sovereign foreign policy, and we're going to vote the way we feel we have to vote in the United Nations, and we're going to question the international financial structures led by the IMF and the World Bank, and we're going to oppose this, and we're going to oppose that, and we're going to fight for Latin American integration. Empires have always opposed the integration of, well, peoples in general, but certainly in the context of the Americas, of Latin America, because divide and rule, obviously. If Latin American countries are united, then they represent a threat to the hegemon. So our policies in favor of Latin American integration have certainly been a threat to the hegemon. And let's not forget that Ecuador is the seat of the UNASUR. That shows Ecuador's commitment towards integration. In fact, it's probably the biggest cause in this institution, the Foreign Ministry, is South American and Latin American integration. So all these things, yeah, sure, they create conflict, and you pay a price for these things. You pay a price for daring. You start getting bad coverage in the international press. You start getting very unfair reports by all sorts of kind of vaguely human rightsy sort of organizations. You start being decertified for things that you're much better at than your neighbors who are not decertified. They're certified by the State Department and other institutions, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is daring to be sovereign. It's about people, it's about citizens, it's about the supremacy of the human being over capital. Unlike what we've been living over the last decades of neoliberalism, which is clearly the supremacy of capital over human beings. I mean, the end is capital. Human beings are just kind of part of the means to achieve that end, you know, especially in terms of labor. Whereas everything we've done, I think, we're not against markets. I mean, the president often says markets are an excellent serf, but a terrible master. So we talk of a society with a market, not a market society, right? You can use the market, but you have to use the market for your own purposes. So to have the supremacy of the human being is the end of all political action. That's why you act, that's why you do public policies, that's why you have an economy in the first place, that's why you have, rather than a labor market, a labor system, in order for the human being to be happy. It's not even in terms of GDP, it's in terms of human happiness. This is the ultimate goal of political action and therefore government policies.
But you know, how did this happen? Because we have presidents in America that come in with a slew of promises. Of course, they don't fulfill any of them. Correa did. He pretty much came in with the platform and enacted it. Talk about the coalition that was built to actually make this happen.
Yeah, it was always a broad coalition. This is important. I come from the left and the anti-neoliberal left. The anti-neoliberal left in the streets that was kind of wanting to put an end to neoliberalism. And we were a small minority. We were lucky when we hit 5% in the elections. You know, usually it was more like 3%. And I think President Correa had the maturity and foresight, just like other presidents in the region. And I think Latin American recent history clearly illustrates this point, to create a real refoundational movement. You create a broad, modernizing coalition that goes probably from the center-left to the Communist Party, including the biggest party in that coalition, which is Alianza País. I mean, it's clearly now the biggest party by far. In our National Assembly, the equivalent of our Congress, out of 137 seats, Alianza País holds 100 seats, so more than a two-thirds majority. So it's a really, but within the party itself, it's fairly heterogeneous, and I think that's been important to the political success in trying to create hegemony through counter-hegemonic means, trying to create a political hegemony on the left, not just having this kind of, not just the left that I come from, which is the more radical left, but having a broader platform. I think that's been very important. And to this day, by and large, that platform is intact. You still have the Communist Party, you still have the Socialist Party, you have Alianza País, you have 4 out of 5 major indigenous movements. There's been a lot of, many attempts on behalf of our corporate media to sell that story abroad that the indigenous are against Correa. I mean, this is absurd. In the last presidential elections in 2013, President Correa won with 57% of the popular vote in the first round of presidential elections. This is the biggest mandate in the history of Ecuador. And he had an even higher vote than the national average for indigenous people, 63%.
It's fascinating that in America, people are so capitalist-minded that they see all the problems around them, but they can't actually point to capitalism as the problem. And so the neoliberalism doctrine has indoctrinated them to actually blaming everything on the state, right? So they can't see that the market is actually, you know, the government's being used as a tool, essentially, by the market.
Sure, I mean, neoliberalism is against public expenditure, make the state small. I mean, I think it's my personal view is that it's harmful in all contexts. It's destroying the welfare state in many places in the world. But in a context like the Latin American context, where you didn't have a state in the first place, I mean, okay, in the European context, you had a welfare state and it's being eroded. But in Latin America, where there was an absence of state already, neoliberalism is folly, it's ideological fundamentalism, and it's extremely harmful. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, it made people poorer, it created huge inequalities. Latin America today is the most unequal continent in the world, and this is shameful for Latin Americans. And I think that any government in power in Latin America that doesn't address the inequality problem head-on is not basically addressing Latin America's problems and its fundamental problem. Most of Latin America's social ills, most of its structural problems have to do with inequality. Urban violence, extremely correlated with inequality. Lack of social cohesion, political instability, all sorts of things that basically at the core of all these things you'll find inequality in an extremely urbanized context, because people often forget that Latin America is one of the most urbanized parts of the world, and inequality in the urban context, we know what the result is. It's high rates of delinquency, of petty crime, of all these kinds of things, which are a major problem. Inequality surged with neoliberalism. The problem is, I think Latin America understood, broadly speaking, there are cases and cases, but understood at the turn of the century that this fundamentalist, fanatic ideology, we call it religion dressed up as science, but it was always a religion. It had nothing scientific about it. Didn't work. Unfortunately, in other parts of the world, I think this realization hasn't yet happened, or it has happened partially, but the hegemony is still neoliberal. And this is having major consequences on global governance, which are very dangerous for everybody, including Ecuador, and we're very concerned about this. But now with the TTIPs and the TPPs and all the kind of these mega continental agreements, they're going to homogenize not just trade issue, but labor, intellectual property. It's the privatization of everything in the world. Natural resources, water, everything in the world is just in this agenda. And we have to fight. I think there is a conscience, and I think the battle isn't won on behalf of neoliberalism. If you speak to countries from all sorts of political backgrounds in the global south, there's a lot of suspicion on that agenda, and multilateralism and international law and anything that's based on the vote of individual states is being completely undermined and sabotaged in favor of these kind of mega multi-continental trade, and not even just trade, but governance pacts that have nothing to do with international law. Basically big business coming together and trying to create a new governance for the world. So I think this is something which, well, we can carry on denouncing from Ecuador and a number of countries in the world. But at the end of the day, this is a fight that the peoples of the world need to give. In the United States, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere in the world. And there are a number of elements that make me more and more hopeful, and political movements that have been in the United States and in Europe, and that are kind of pushing a pro-human being agenda as opposed to only a pro-capital agenda, and I hope that we can carry on giving this fight. We were completely permeated by foreign domination. We even had a US military base in Manta, which I think we had the courage to say thank you, but no thank you. Probably still paying quite a high price for that bravery. We did offer the United States to keep the military base in exchange for an Ecuadorian military base in Miami, but that was turned down.
Speaking of the military base, I find this really fascinating because people need to hear these kind of comparisons. When we're fear-mongered about Russia and China, knowing that China only has one base that's foreign. And so it's really important to understand when you're talking about an empire that has 900 bases around the world, how ludicrous it really is in the context of when Korea says, yeah, if you can put an Ecuadorian military base in Miami, sure. And that's just mind-blowing for people. But it's super important to provide that context. Of course, he infamously shut down that base in Manta, but that was the most strategic U.S. base in its so-called war on drugs. Really affected the whole U.S. endeavor in this region. Chancellor, what was the reason for shutting down that base? Because, of course, the U.S. line is that Ecuador just doesn't care about curbing cocaine trafficking.
Well, first of all, I would question whether the US base was really being used in its full capacity in the war on drugs, or it played another purpose, and I would argue the latter. I mean, it played a huge geopolitical purpose in the Colombian conflict, but also in surveying all sorts of aspects in the Andean and the Amazonian region, both on the domestic political front, from our point of view, keeping close tab to everything that's going on, and also in the geostrategic sector, natural resources. We had loads of those airplanes with satellite dishes, the big white ones, flying over our territory with an amazing capacity to watch what's going on and in all sorts of aspects. But certainly the end of the Manta base did not mean an increase in the trafficking of drugs from Ecuador or from the region to the United States. In any event, we have declared ourselves a territory free of foreign military bases of any country in the world. It's in our constitution.
But you're talking about a changing world, and that's certainly what we're seeing today. A huge shift in consciousness. We have this pink tide. Ecuador was certainly part of this left-wing rise of a new axis of leftist powers that emerged that really challenged big capitalist powers in the world. But now we're seeing a kind of right-wing resurgence, Argentina and beyond. Why do you think this is happening, and how does Ecuador plan to stay on its current path?
But, President Correa's popularity ratings are above 60% after 9.5 years. I think that's like the world record. I mean, it's huge. So I don't necessarily see that as being systematic in the whole region, number one. And number two, I think that even where there has been a return of the right wing in power, through democratic means, because in other cases there are a few questions about democracy, but in the cases where elections have been won, if you look at who's in opposition and the chunk of the opposition of the left, that's important as well. I said earlier on in this interview that we come from a left that reaped 3, 4, 5% of the total vote. We were like, this same left that I come from, in opposition in many other countries where it's lost with 48, 49, 49.5% of the vote. It's the opposition. It's there to stay. It might even win the next elections. It often has a legislative majority. It's a completely different reality from the neoliberalism of the 1990s. So, okay, this is a reality. I'm not going to deny that there's been a weakening. If you count the number of countries that are being ruled by left-wing governments, there's been a weakening of the left in South America and in Latin America in general. But if you look at the big picture, and if you look at the 21st century, I think the 21st century is going to be about Latin America playing a very different role, with the recurrence of left-wing nationalist governments in power at different conjunctures.
Let's be real. We have a threatening superpower that wants regime change here. And there's a lot of efforts going on the ground that you're talking about with NGOs, CIA fronts, etc. I mean, how does that affect the way that the Ecuadorian government operates?
There are consequences to your acts, to your sovereign acts, to your nationalist acts that are visible, but there are others that are not said, that are not explicit. Imperialism today isn't necessarily the same as it was 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. Things change. There's a lot of funneling of money to different organizations. The whole NGO agenda is very important in the foreign policy of a number of countries. And there are a number of virtuous NGOs in this country, but there are a few NGOs that have played a strategic role in funneling money from abroad to opposition figures, to specific programs that are aimed basically at weakening us, at eroding us. There are more subtle strategies today in order to erode a country and a country's sovereignty. We'd love to be able to work with the United States hand in hand on an equal basis with mutual respect for the sovereignty of both countries. Unfortunately, it's not always possible. There's still this kind of ongoing, going back to the Jacksonian days of manifest destiny, that's still a part of US ideology and deeply ingrained in the US institutions, private and public. The United States thinks it's the United Nations. The United States thinks it should police the world. The United States thinks it should overrule international law. And the United States think that it's, got this kind of, again, manifest destiny to intervene everywhere where nobody's asked them to intervene. And that's something which I think only the United States can resolve. If you carry on being perceived by the world as an imperial power, eventually that will affect your power. Eventually, divide and rule won't work anymore. Eventually, people will unite and say, enough is enough.